but then also leans into that like comedic, leans into that like keeping the cast small, and the sort of magic of puppetry of being able to increase the effect of what is a pretty small ensemble of people to do a whole classroom of children or a whole village of people, and it really like punches up that storytelling. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to No Script, an unscripted conversation about theater's best scripts. I'm Jackson, that's Jacob, and we are back. I'm back from a week away. Last week, if you haven't listened to it already, was our special guest episode. So I was away for that one, but it's a great conversation. If you haven't had the chance yet, go ahead and check that one out as well. But I'm excited to be back this week to talk about another great script with all of you.
Yeah, good to have you back, but coming back to like a regular conversation after the guest episode is kind of a trip. The guest episodes are super fun. They always bring something so delightful and so different. In this case, something that we've wanted to do on No Script for like 13 seasons, to be able to like really focus on what's happening in the music, because musicals, in terms of drama, like the music is contributing to the storytelling. It doesn't just function as music, it functions as a storytelling feature. And Dr. David Cody talked a lot about that, and a lot about why Sondheim is sort of recognized as the master at that particular skill that he is, and then a lot about the really unique, interesting, kind of small, subtle things you may not know about the music of Into the Woods. Super fun conversation. I just had a blast. I hope you've had a chance to listen to it. Like Jackson said, if you haven't, just go back, check it out. I know you'll have fun with it, especially if you're a musical person. I think it'll really, really open your eyes to some of what's going on more broadly in musicals, and then just learn a ton from somebody who really, really knows what he's talking about. Great special guest episode, but I'm excited to be back for this conversation about today's episode. Is like, it's kind of a weird play. In the best way, it's kind of a weird play.
It's true. It's going to be a fun adjustment into this play today. Excited for the conversation, though. It's a new playwright to the podcast, which is exciting. Excited to be talking about Land o' Fire today by Luis Santeiro. And this play, which is this great sort of like blend of high theatricality, high sort of adjacent to like a historical theater, storytelling, comedic, also heartbreaking. All sorts of things in there.
Yeah, this play is super interesting, in part because some to like my own sort of shame and ignorance. Like, this is not a story that I knew. It's part of a more broad, the story of this play is part of a more broad history of colonialism, in this case, specifically by the British government. And so certainly, we're aware of that maybe history in a more broad sense, but the kinds of specific stories, the specific things that were carried out during that period are, I think, probably intentionally hidden away in the annals of history by the kind of white super colonial powers of the world. And so this play brings that to light. It's certainly, in the summary paragraph that is sort of everywhere for this play on all the different websites, it really describes it as telling this story from the perspective of the indigenous people who encounter these British colonial forces, the military expedition forces. That's an interesting way to describe this play to me a little bit, because I do think that like the primary avenue in is from this British Fitzroy character, and his sort of walking through the story is what we follow, even while certainly what Luis Santeiro is doing is poking holes in the narrative that this British force, this history of the superior culture, right, is that quote unquote phrase. He pokes holes in that narrative specifically. So it's an interesting play to be described as like from the perspective of the indigenous people, because I do think that the sort of outlook of the story is perhaps that, even while like the narratively, I'm not sure that is how we follow it.
Yeah, that's interesting. There is some kind of question about structure and things like that, and who gets what time on stage. And we often turn to that sort of conversation once we're into the meat of it, because we are script analyzers, because that's a new word now. And so yeah, definitely there'll be some fun conversation around that, and excited to also to continue to explore that theme that you've kind of brought up. This sort of like addressing the colonial false narrative that has been sort of propounded around. So excited for that conversation. Worth noting at the top of the episode, as we always do, just noticing our kind of cultural viewpoint as two white guys talking about this play. We're going to kind of bring our own contexts and voices to this conversation. But as always, don't let ours be the only ones you're listening to. This play is a great play, and excited to kind of be a place that talks about theater's best scripts and continue to broaden that conversation out to more voices as well. So check out other conversations in addition to ours as we jump into Land of Fire.
Yeah, it should be a fun conversation, especially because, I mean, there are puppets in this play.
Yes.
There is wild sort of layered meta storytelling going on in this play. It is the historical story of this particular interaction between the British colonial forces and an indigenous population. It is that. And then it's also this other thing that's going on about the storytelling of that story. And both things are happening, which should be a fascinating sort of thing to try to unpack. Before we get too far into it, we are inviting you to go check out our Patreon page, patreon.com/noscriptpodcast. That's where you can become a supporter of the show. Our almost full 13 seasons now are supported by the folks on Patreon. We aren't able to do this podcast in the way that it exists without that financial support. We'd love to do it. It's great to talk about. We get to talk about crazy, interesting, cool plays like this. But we just couldn't afford to do it, just pretty simply, without that financial support. So thanks to the folks over on Patreon. If that's not you yet, just check it out. Patreon.com/noscriptpodcast. All one word, no hyphens, no underscores. There's different amounts that you can sort of join the Patreon community by supporting us at a certain dollar amount a month. The lowest tier, just $1 a month, $12 over the course of the year. A lot of folks out there that if I just needed $12 for some random problem in my life, you just like give the $12, $1 a month. Even at that level, that low level, you are hugely supporting the podcast. So encourage you to consider that. Check out some of the other benefits over there. Hope to see you there. Big thanks to our supporters. You make doing the podcast possible. Patreon.com/noscriptpodcast.
Yes, thank you all so much for being patrons of the show. Y'all are the greatest. We'll see you at patreon.com/noscriptpodcast. And now, back to the script.
But first, a couple of announcements before we dive into the script we have coming up. This is the second to last episode of the season. So we have one more episode that'll come out next week. And then we will be taking our regular sort of winter break. If you're following us along as the episodes release, winter 2024, 2025, we'll take a short break and be back sometime in the spring 2025 semester to begin our next season, season 14. We always take these breaks. Good to take a break. Excited to be back. I know that season 14 will be hugely wild and interesting, as all the seasons are. But you've got this episode and next episode before we head on break. We look forward to those conversations and to seeing you back for season 14. And now back to the script.
Well, fine.
Hey, we both got to do it. That seems like a positive, right? A positive development there. So, Luis Santeiro is a new playwright to the podcast. I'm actually going to have a lot more info about him than I do about the play itself. The play itself has not had a huge production history, so I'll present what I know and what I could find. But he, as a playwright, as a screenwriter, as a musician, and a librettist, is a really interesting person. In some ways, I was thinking about doing the synopsis first for this episode, because some of what I'm about to reveal about Luis Santeiro is really elucidative of what this show is. So I just want to remind us before I dive in that this is a show. I'll give the most like one sentence version of the summary, and then Jackson can take over for a more broad one. The one sentence summary, right, is that the British colonial forces encounter an uncontacted indigenous tribe, kidnap some of those folks, bring them back to England, and then bring them back eventually. And that story is told through puppets. So that's the sort of one sentence view. And that's important as I dive into Luis Santeiro here. He's a Cuban American playwright. His family migrated to Miami in 1947 from Cuba. And that kind of coming to Miami and the Miami community has been really important in his life and his work. I was just listening to an interview about a cabaret that he was doing in Miami in 2019. His great grandfather, sort of strangely as just a cool fact, was Gerardo Machado, who is the president of Cuba from 1925 to 1933. So he came to Miami when he was 12 years old with his family, and he ended up studying sociology. But eventually he starts work as a screenwriter, and that's really what he's primarily known for. He's a really well-lauded, highly awarded screenwriter for his work primarily on children's shows. And now we get into something interesting. So he wrote for what is sort of commonly known as the first bilingual situational comedy ever, called Que Pase USA, which apparently is really big in Miami. So that's cool feature for him. But he really became known and awarded and recognized for his work writing for Sesame Street.
Hey.
Sesame Street, which is a children's TV show. I know everybody knows this, but I'm explaining it because of its relation to this script, which is a children's TV show which functions in the combination of live humans and puppets. It is neither just live humans or just puppets. It is both, and the relationships between them. There's a great interview about the relationship of Bert and Ernie that you should listen to. Really, really fascinating. He won a ton of different awards for Sesame Street writing. Also, more specifically, the Edward Kleban and Richard Rogers Award. The National Hispanic Academy of Media Arts and Sciences awarded him as a playwright for his play A Royal Affair. He's also been recognized for his contributions specifically as a Latino artist, with honors such as the Hispanic Achievement Award and the Hispanic Heritage Award. Some of his other plays some of these have a little bit more robust production history than this one in particular. A Royal Affair, I think, is maybe most generally his known play, as well as Mixed Blessings, Our Lady of the Tortilla, great title, Praying with the Enemy, and The Lady from Havana. He also has a memoir, Dancing with Dictators, a family's journey from pre-Castro Cuba to exile in the turbulent 60s. As you can imagine, it's about his experience of moving with his family from Cuba to Miami. So this play, I can't find other production history other than its world premiere production in 2007 with the Jersey City Theater Center. A little bit of an interesting story about that particular production. The Jersey City Theater Collective was really just getting started at that point. They had been founded in 2006, and so this was 2007. This is one of their first productions. And so the Jersey City Theater Center they're trying to sort of contribute to the arts in New Jersey, right? However, they're having a hard time at this moment finding suitable theater space, is how they define it on their website, in Jersey City. And so, with the help of Jorge Cachero, who is a theater director, they were able to do this production, Land of Fire, not in Jersey City, but in New York City, just across the river. That's just the only place they could find the space, at the Wings Theater. And so that became kind of a noteworthy production for that theater center, because while it was really well received and got good reviews and audiences liked it sold well, all that kind of stuff, it was not quite in the mission of what the Jersey City Theater Center wanted to do, in that they were presenting in New York City instead of contributing to the Jersey City arts community. So it ends up, this particular play production ends up being part of the history of that theater company, and they sort of decide to rededicate themselves to doing stuff specifically in Jersey. So interesting play history. I mean, it's sort of a limited production history for sure, but Luis Santeiro, a really fascinating, interesting guy. He's children's television writing. He wrote for K-Pos USA, as I said, and then also has this whole career as a lyricist, a librettist, a composer. In the COVID pandemic, he received a bunch of publicity because he apparently sort of turned to painting. I mean, obviously he's coming out of screenwriting and playwriting and music writing, right? And so the pandemic shuts all that down, and so he becomes a painter. And he does a lot of interviews about how painting kept his sort of creative spark alive during the pandemic. Super fascinating guy to write this super fascinating puppet play.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, this play, I'm going to give you just a little bit more of a summary of sort of some of the action of this play. Definitely starts with some it's cool to know that he wrote for Sesame Street, and there's this kind of through line of puppeteering and theatricality that is going to kind of be a note that you'll hear a little bit in the summary, but more so in our conversation afterwards. I'll jump in real quick here, though. This play takes place in the 1830s, and the action takes place in the Tierra del Fuego archipelago, which is the South Horn of South America, England, and various points in between. The play sort of the play begins with a large kind of ensemble presentation of all the actors of this play. This is a six-hander, I believe, 3 men, 3 women, kind of being all the roles in this play. However, there are in addition to the long or I guess in specificity to the long list of characters that these 6 actors will play, there are 4 that we stay with for a long time. There are Fitzroy, Captain Fitzroy, who pilots or captains the Beagle, which is the ship that is sailing through the Tierra del Fuego archipelago. And then there is York, Fugia, and Jemmy. Now, these are 3 names of folks who are native to the Tierra del Fuego archipelago, but they're given names by the crew. They're the names that are in the script for them, and so I'll continue to address them by those names in my summary. However, they also have their own names, which is, as best as I can pronounce, Eliparu, Yakushlu, and Orundeleko. So, but we will continue with York, Fugia, and Jemmy. The play starts in this sort of theatricalized storytelling mode of all the native folk of the archipelago telling the story of seeing ships sailing by. This is the age of European colonialism, and everyone was trying to figure out how to get around the Horn of South America because it's very stormy, very close to Antarctica. And so the journey through the archipelago and trying to navigate a safer way to traverse that area was an often occurring thing. And so they tell the story of ships sailing past and sinking, ships eventually sailing past and figuring out a way through, and eventually this ship actually makes it through and makes it to the island. What then proceeds is basically a kidnapping story. Captain Fitzroy, either through straight up kidnapping or sort of non equivalent bartering, getting a father to basically pay or receive a pearl for his son. He gathers these 3 onto his ship out of sort of a scientific, maybe sort of definitely colonialism, definitely sort of like moralistic Christianity, sort of let's teach these people their place within Christendom sort of mode. And so he brings on Fugia, who is the first member to kind of be left on board the ship and sort of sails along with them. And she's a very little girl who he kind of like slowly takes under his wing and starts teaching, or gets the doctor on board to start teaching her English. Then we get Jemmy, who is a curious little boy who gets on board the ship and starts just sort of taking things as his father is trying to negotiate cross language barriers. Captain Fitzroy is like, well, let's figure out this kid looks curious. Maybe we'll be able to teach him English, and we need a translator. And so he bargains for him with a little pearl button and collects Jemmy on board the ship as well. York is straight up captured. York jumps on the ship and tries tries to kind of do a raid on the ship, but he is overcome by the rest of the crew. And so the three of them are sort of kidnapped aboard the ship as Captain Fitzroy continues to explore the archipelago. What proceeds for the rest of Act 1 is this sort of journey of them being educated into English English language, English customs, English norms, and they're coming up against that and resisting that, butting up against that, the sort of juxtaposition of this doctor who's trying to teach them English and the ways of the English, kind of coming up against their own context and their own language. So the journey eventually extends, though, outside of the archipelago, and Fitzroy says, you know what, I think I'm going to take them back to England and kind of give them a proper Christian education, get them introduced to people. I think that they'll be of value to them, and eventually we'll bring them home, having been in the capital for enough time to bring them back home and be of service to their community in the proper British way. So they start a long journey home. There's lots of foibles along the way, but they eventually cross the Atlantic again and return to England, which kind of begins its own series of events. As Fitzroy comes home, he meets his mother again for the first time in 2 years, kind of makes a jarring adjustment back into his own society, but also is aware suddenly. He writes to the Crown and asks for help in sort of acclimating York, Fugia, and Jemmy into English culture, and the Crown basically says, good luck with that. So it's on him to figure out what to do with them. He gets them board and schooling at a Christian school, which goes various degrees of poorly. All along the way, York and Fugia and Jemmy are kind of learning British language, English language, and culture, and acclimating in various ways. Jemmy is quick to acclimate. He's very interested in English culture. He learns the language the fastest of all. Fugia is also very interested in it. York is pretty resistant to it, and continues to be resistant to it throughout the course of the play. Eventually, York sort of forces a relationship on Fugia, and they kind of couple up for a good chunk of the play, as kind of in the midst of this time when they're sort of boarding, sort of prisoners at this school. And as they are continuing to kind of move towards christening of them into the sort of Church of England. To briefly sum up the rest of the action of the play, they eventually are cause enough of a stir at enough parties to earn the attention of the king. The king invites them over and kind of hears the story of their island, which they tell to some degree truthfully, but to some degree to impress both Captain Fitzroy and the king and queen. And so they kind of embellish this story. The king and queen are enamored and send them with a bunch of gifts. They also recommission Fitzroy to return to South America and continue his research, and ultimately return York, Fugia, and Jemmy back to their homes. So Fitzroy begins a journey back. He starts hiring a crew, and one of the notable people on the crew is Charles Darwin, who will kind of be along for the rest of the ride. This is assumedly his ship that kind of takes them on one of his more formative travels of the world. They cross back across the Atlantic, and it slowly begins to dawn on Jemmy, especially, that he's going to be dropped off back at what was his home, but he doesn't feel like it's his home anymore, and so he keeps trying to stay with Captain Fitzroy, but over and over Fitzroy says essentially, like, this is not what I was intending, and you have to go home, back to where you came from. They drop them off along with a missionary who they spend some time trying to build up this community in a proper British way, and it just doesn't go well, appropriately so, as they try to sort of implement British culture onto these people overnight, essentially. There is resistance to that, and it all sort of falls apart. The mission is turned aside. Fitzroy sends him back to the ship, but ultimately the heartbreaking part is he pretty much abandons Jemmy on the island. York and Fugia kind of go through. They also are abandoned there as a result of their time in England, but they sort of end up taking a canoe and finding a way off into the background of the story by the end of the play. We're left, though, with this last couple months of a journey that Fitzroy goes on, more discoveries. Assuredly, he goes with Darwin to the Galapagos Islands and comes back. And tries to find Jemmy, and Jemmy kind of paddles out in a canoe, kind of fully back in his sort of first home's attire, and presenting as a Tierra del Fuego islander. And he comes on the ship though, and once again is still able to communicate in English. Kind of tells the story of how like the mission or the sort of set of cottages that they built has slowly been spread out over the islands. He's sort of reacclimated into that society, and even though Fitzroy offers him the chance to go back to England again, he turns it down and says, "I'm married here now. I have a family here now. My life is here now." And that's sort of the end of the play. There's some sort of reflection, monologuing at the end of the play. Again, this sort of storytelling element of the process of how these people then acclimate the things that York and Fugia and Jemmy brought back with them to the island from England. And that sort of like takes us out of the play with again this ensemble of islanders all telling this story to us.
Yeah, and so Santeiro has adapted this story from the annals of history. This is, in some sense, a true story in that this gentleman, Fitzroy, on a ship called the Beagle, certainly kidnapped these indigenous folks from Tierra del Fuego and ends up parading them around Britain in a kind of display of their, uncivilized, sort of savage behavior is the racist perspective, and how he could civilize them and teach them this Christianity and take them back. And the idea then is that if he teaches them this sort of proper, superior way to live, he'll take them back and they'll teach the islanders. And that is how the great British Christian, white culture is going to spread across the world. Obviously, part of a really dreadful, violent colonial history out of a lot of the European countries and the United States of America. And the play does a lot of work to poke fun at that, to highlight the way in which it is going to be a failure from the very beginning, certainly a lot of like pretty clear negative representations of the British colonial forces in general. But there's also this other way in which Santeiro has adapted the story, which is that it is not just a straight historical retelling of the play, even a comedic one. There is a framework for the context in which this story is being told. And we meet at the very beginning of the play. All the actors are, the actors are playing folks from Tierra del Fuego, these indigenous peoples. And they have, the stage is very bare. It's a pretty imaginative show. They pull out small props and costume pieces to play other characters. But this group of folks who are, actors who are playing Tierra del Fuego Islanders, they are telling the story using what they say are the theatrical conventions of speaking to the audience, speaking, I think, to a sort of a white Western culture, like your theatrical conventions. And so it is a little bit, this is the kind of play that so much is going on in the live doing of it that it's a little bit hard to get all the way there in the reading of it. But all of these British characters that the islanders meet as they're paraded around Britain and that say, racist, like I'm the superior culture type stuff all throughout, and that treat the three folks from Tierra del Fuego as, infantile ways, that say all this stuff. They're all being played by the people of color who are playing these, islander people. And so the meta story is a little bit difficult to really like hold in your mind as you're reading the play, but it's so much of what is going on in how the story is retold.
Yeah, there's so much theatricality and choices with it being a theater play that just don't translate to the script all that well. Don't or I'm sorry, not the script, but the paper all that well. And so there's so many of those pieces, not least of which is let's get right into the puppetry, because we've teased it for such a long time. So much of this story, certainly the big beats of the story, are told with either puppets or silhouette or suggestion or sort of paper cutout style puppets. There's so much of this sort of like steeping in this this particular way of storytelling, this very visual form of storytelling that enhances what is at least called to be a pretty sparse theatrical production. You know, sparse staging, sparse sort of theatrical effects are then heightened, though, as a result of this very evocative puppetry throughout the play.
Yeah, so here's an example of that. So after Fitzroy has brought the three folks from Tierra del Fuego to England, he's having a hard time finding a place for them to stay because there has been these rumors spread that they're cannibals. And so he eventually brings them to this school that is really sort of about the school's idea is sort of to take people who are poor and people who are outcasts for some ways and like teach them strict Christian morals. It's a whole thing about that, right? And so here's an example both of the puppets and how Santeiro is sort of poking fun at that particular historical worldview. So they meet the school teacher, the schoolmaster, the whatever, and he introduces them to some puppets. So to some puppets / people / children. Here's what the stage direction says. 2 cast members hold up a row of small puppets, simple cutouts with articulated limbs. The puppets break into song, during which they rise and sit. So these puppets are representing the other children in the school. I think it's super, as weird and subtle a small thing as this is, for Santeiro to be able to put a note in there, not only about them being puppets, but the type of puppets he wants. That's Sesame Street coming through all the way. I mean, that's just not that the Sesame Street ethos or anything, but like his particular work, right? Coming through in something that he particularly can do maybe better than anybody else. So we meet these puppets, children, right? The other classroom, and they end up doing this demonstration of like what they've been learning. Jenkins describes, apparently this was the sort of philosophical worldview of this particular school at the time, that teaching the students these kinesthetic movements, the sort of somatic body practices along with their schooling was going to make them smarter or something. So as he sort of quizzes them, he gives them a letter. All these row of puppets are doing these absurd little movements that have no connection with the learning other than they've learned that they are a pair, that when they say this, they do this. When they say this, they do this. So there's this whole demonstration of the learning style. So it says Jenkins leads the children into song. Each time they sing a B word, they either sit or stand, which happens more and more frequently as the song progresses. And there's all these other kinds of actions that they're doing.
Yeah. So there's this like, I love the image of these like this army of cutouts, right? Of these children, all on stage, sort of like rising and sitting as they sing through the song. And that sort of illustrates that point. There's lots of moments, like the beginning of the play is a puppetry moment with like the ship sinking. There's all this beautiful, like this like image in my mind of like this it's just described as this like Nordic style Viking ship flows through the archipelago and then slowly sinks in the Straits of Magellan. on the Tierra del Fuego archipelago. It's beautiful, evocative imagery, but then also leans into that like comedic, leans into that like keeping the cast small, and the sort of magic of puppetry of being able to increase the effect of what is a pretty small ensemble of people to do a whole classroom of children or a whole village of people, and it really like punches up that storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, there's another moment late after the three folks have been maybe more introduced, forced into a particular sort of British European culture. They're now meeting aristocrats, and a whole puppet sort of parade of British white aristocrats come through. And they say all kinds of really sort of paternalistic things about these folks, as you might expect. But they're puppets. And again, it's all like, you all have to always, as you're reading, be remembering this sort of other layer that the people playing these white British folks as actual humans are not white British folks, and that's a part of the storytelling level too. So all throughout this presentation of, I don't think at any point you believe like, oh, this is the real thing, how it happened word for word. It's a little too silly for that. But even if you did, Santeiro constantly is reminding you through the theatricality that this is commentary is maybe a little strong, but this is like a presentation of this thing from history. Yeah. We are doing something now through the puppets, through the casting, to talk about what happened then.
Yes, definitely. So a lot of the action of the play kind of takes place in this sort of like, especially once they hit England, there's a lot of scene work. The play kind of takes on this more typical Western play scene work sort of stuff. But the puppets, and then also the narrator, who frequently shows up, sort of keep us in that first moment of the play of this is a group of people coming together to tell a story, and so every once in a while you get that little bit of alienation from the puppets that's like, remember, we're telling a story. Remember, we're actually in the moment critiquing some of this. Remember, this isn't just a series of events. We're hearkening back and trying to draw something out of it, which the end of the play does lean into that. There's a lot of reflection on whether or not this sort of colonialism works. It lands on it doesn't. But there's Darwin kind of, as he kind of is inserted into the end of the play, kind of serves as this like, maybe this didn't work out for you, Fitzroy. Sort of role of after they've come back to the island and Jemmy has sort of acclimated to his home island. There's this moment of Fitzroy is like, oh, well, I guess that was 3 years. That didn't matter. And Darwin is like, well, you probably shouldn't have done it in the first place. And second of all, maybe we've learned something as a result of that.
Yeah, definitely. And through that whole sequence in Britain, which is like, it's probably in page count like 2/3 of the play are close to it. It just happens to be located like in the middle rather at one end or the other. That is the sort of huge bulk of what the play is this sequence of scenes while the folks are in Britain. And it does take on a kind of like comedy of manners perspective, where a lot of what's going on is that almost through kind of a stranger comes to town lens, where the ridiculousness both of the culture itself and of the idea that this culture is superior to any other culture is really heavily critiqued as these three folks are being sometimes threatened, sometimes bribed, sometimes whatever, forced in some way to conform to these British standards of behavior. What Santeiro has chosen to show us are particular sort of wildly silly standards of behavior, like the classroom sort of movement sort of thing. They're, at one point they're given all kinds of lavish gifts by the British aristocracy. And then it's those gifts that end up sort of scattered throughout the island, sort of based on their usefulness or non-usefulness to life in that particular part of the world at that particular time. And so you get this kind of, the story is like, it shows you both like, look at how silly all this stuff was, and we're going to tell you that through this method that is non-realistic. And so the kind of perspective on this being like, apparently in the notes from the playwright throughout the script, like he's done a fair amount of research, including journals and different translations. I mean, a lot of the language, in as much as it exists now, is included in the play. And so there is like a historical research sort of backbone to the play, but he's like specifically decided to give you this other presentation of the events.
Yeah, I do like the analogy of Stranger Comes to Town, because it really, like, it's there in multiple levels of juxtaposition throughout this play, because you have Fitzroy there at the beginning. He's the stranger in town, and then it becomes York, Fugia, and Jemmy pretty quickly are the stranger in town, and their juxtapositions against or contrasts against society are sort of the disorienting things, the things that, like, kind of shove them, we feel along with them, shoved out of context. One of the big ones is just, like, kind of the sexual awareness of the characters versus English sort of more prudish, keep it under the emotions level sort of a relationship between them. So over and over there are these things that can continue to come up for them as they engage in this sort of wild, new, low context experience for them, kind of pushes us into those juxtaposition moments.
Yeah, it's like, we become kind of low context viewers, even though the Western white culture that the play is looking at is a lot of that stuff is still sort of a part of American culture, like the affluent part of American culture. We don't quite have an aristocracy, but a lot of the kind of conventional social behaviors that the play points out are still around, and maybe even they're particularly picked by Santeiro to do that comparison. But because we come into it with these three other folks whose encounter with that behavior is not familiar, we're allowed to sort of see it from a non-familiar lens. I think that is really brought into clarity with Fitzroy's particular, let's call it a scientific outlook. Fitzroy is a believer in phrenology. He's a phrenologist, which my very limited understanding of that is this idea that your actual physical traits, including like the length of your forehead, the shape of your nose, your jawline, your chest, actual measurements from your body are indicative of and controlled by your social place, your job, your personality characteristics, your education. And actually, as you change, as you grow up and become, as you might change jobs, or in this case, Fitzroy, like as he quote unquote educates and civilizes these three folks as they embrace this new culture, that is going to be seen in an actual change to your physical characteristics. Again, things like the shape of your nose, the length of your forehead, your upper lip, etc. And so at various times throughout the play, Fitzroy actually measures all kinds of people, and he's making specific judgments about their character, their education, their potential. It's almost a little bit like astrology kind of is used in a sort of like this characteristic, like when you were born, determines certain things about your life and worldview. I think both sides of that coin would probably be mad at me for that comparison, so I'll leave it at that. But that is what he does throughout the play. He measures people and he makes determinations about them and their characteristics. And there is, to me, this musical really comes home in this moment late in the play. After Fitzroy and his company of white British folks have left, and they've left the three islander folks that they kidnapped, they're back on the island there with Jemmy. Jemmy has this moment, he's by himself, and he, the stage direction says, he uncoils a measuring tape. Captain Fitzroy appears in a spotlight. Jemmy walks over, eyeing him with clinical interest. And I'm just going to skip around a little bit in this section just to give you an idea. So he says, Englishman, tall and proud, but it all a big trick of superior civilization. He measures different parts of Fitzroy and says things like 6 centimeters, indicates he's from a strong attachment to people and places. He measures the width of his forehead. He shows great interest in new people. He measures his head. And here's, I think, where it really comes home. I'll quote specifically now rather than just summarizing. He will show strong feeling for supreme being, because supreme being kind enough to make him supreme man, which is a sort of chattering a commentary on his religion, right? So to me, that reorienting that use of phrenology from Jemmy's point of view at the end is where all of this non-realism, particular way in which the story is told is really brought to a head.
Yeah. It's such a good. Such a good wielding of that scientific thought process, because I mean, obviously we know this theory has been completely debunked. We know that it was an instrumental part of colonialism for a long time. It was used to abuse a lot of people, and so like giving that early on to Captain Fitzroy as like, I'm a phrenologist, we're all like, oh boy. So it's this great kind of like little bit of like dog whistle in there, right? Of like, okay, so this is what we know you're about. But then to see it sort of that reversal, that utilizing of it to tell story, to kind of bring it around with Jemmy using it on Fitzroy at the end is just really good reversal of using something that is kind of a firmly established known thing that tells us something about the character that we know that we probably won't like a lot of the actions that this character is going to do, and then using it in a reversal moment in such a poignant way to continue to amplify that story.
Yeah, and it certainly it drives home this kind of idea that's a little bit smuggled into the play. In other words, I mean, like not said out loud, but argued by doing rather than speaking, which is this idea that like all of this superior cultural analysis, right? We're the white British Western Christian culture, and we're superior to all these other cultures we're going to encounter, is based on a lie, is based on a misbelief about the world. And the same kind of superior judgment you apply to these other cultures can be taken back on you. And that flip in perspective is part of what the play does. That's again why I think the play describes itself in the summaries as being from the perspective of these three indigenous folks. Even though I actually think Fitzroy's point of view in the play, like if we're thinking about like behind his eyes, is how the play works structurally, chronologically. The point of view of the play is that perspective, that switch in perspective that happens.
Yeah. Again, kind of hearkening back to the opening moment of the play, which is the people of the Tierra del Fuego archipelago telling the story. They're telling it a lot about Fitzroy. We get a lot of scenes where Fitzroy is off stage from York, Fugia, and Jemmy. A lot of scenes with his family and stuff like that. So the kind of interior action of the play is often point of view Fitzroy. However, always, again, through all the things that we've been talking about, we're reminded of the fact that this is a broader story, a meta story that is being talked about by the storytellers, the narrator who frequently shows up, and these people who are telling this story. So it does great work of kind of centering both of those narratives simultaneously.
Yeah, there's so much more to talk about there. Really, really cool play. I hope it gets a little bit more of an eye, maybe part of No Script. We can bring this sort of play to a more broad audience who may not have encountered it. I hope that's sort of part of what happens here. We love to talk about plays like this. I certainly had no sense of this play, and so really cool to encounter it. A lot more we could talk about, but we're out of time for today, and we are close to out of time for the season.
Yeah. We have only got one more episode left after today. Have no fear, as we mentioned. We will be back with season 14 in just a few short times. Sometime in the new year, we'll be back with that next season coming your way. But one more episode left. In the meantime, though, we'd love to continue chatting about this play with all of you, or any of the other plays from this season or other seasons. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, social media accounts, probably still X. I'm gonna get on Threads eventually. We'll keep finding ways to chat with you. You can also find us on Gmail, which is noscriptpodcast@gmail.com. Username for all the social media is @noscriptpodcast. Find us on any of those sites. We'd love to keep chatting about this play with you.
If you enjoyed this conversation or any of our other conversations, please recommend us to your family or friends. Anybody you know that likes theater, storytelling, conversations about writing, send them our way. Think they'll enjoy what they find. They can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere where you find your podcasts. A link to the new episode also appears every Monday when we publish. One more episode of the season and then we're on break. We'll see you next week. I'm Jacob. That's Jackson. Thanks for joining us for No Script.